Up, we have Dr. Liesel Ritchie. Liesel is serving on the advisory board for National Academies, and she'll tell you a little bit about her role at the Center for the Study of Disasters and Extreme Events at Oklahoma State University.
Good morning. Good morning. I guess a number of you are wondering perhaps why someone from Oklahoma State University would be down here. I can tell you a little bit about that as we go forward. I want to start by thanking you for inviting me to not only share my research findings over the years, but also for the opportunity to be able to learn from you. The things that I'm about to share are from essentially listening to communities over the years that have experienced oil spills, and the BP Deepwater Horizon event is the fourth one that I have studied since I began doing so in about 2001. I am a sociologist, so you now have three of us in a row, so we won't be having a test at the end of this, but you can see similar comments that Tim and Catherine and I will be making. I specialized in human-caused or technological disaster events, so not just marine oil spills, but other toxic contamination events, including one of the more recent Tennessee Valley Authority coal ash spills that affected a community in Roane County, Tennessee. I've been a member of the Gulf Research Program for about 4 years now, and what I'm going to present is a summary of the kinds of things we know, not necessarily from a specific project with which I've been involved, and I would venture to say that most of what I'm going to share with you has to do with things that you already know, things that you have experienced in the event that you actually live in a community that was affected by the oil spill in 2010. I want to point out that despite the different locations that I'm going to talk about and the different time frames in which these different spills happen, that many of the social impacts are similar, if not the same. A lot of what we heard right after Deepwater Horizon was that this is different. It's a different ecological environment. The oil's not going to respond the same way. The dispersants are different. But having said all of that, the majority of the social impacts that we've seen post-Deepwater Horizon have been very, very similar to what we saw in the aftermath of the Exxon Valdez, in the aftermath of the Celandine IU shipwreck and oil spill in Dutch Harbor in Alaska, and the wreck of the Costco Busan in the San Francisco Bay Area. So just a little bit, I first started studying marine oil spills in 2001. I was part of a team that had started to study the Exxon Valdez oil spill and its social impacts back in 1989. So with Dwayne Gill and Steve Piku, I was brought on board during my dissertation research. So I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time in Cordova, Alaska, which is considered ground zero for the Exxon Valdez oil spill. A lot of the things that we know about oil spills in particular are derived, as Tim mentioned, from the earliest work on the Exxon Valdez oil spill. We too did a number of different kinds of studies, ranging from longitudinal studies that were cross-sectional, panel studies or cohort studies, as Tim mentioned, of the same people over time. And our research actually didn't wrap up until 2008, 2009, into 2010, after the Supreme Court made its decision about the consequences of the Exxon Valdez oil spill for the Exxon Valdez primary responsible parties, at that point Exxon and then Mobil. Most of our research is funded by the National Science Foundation. My dissertation research was self-funded, so the time that I spent there was a really personal investment as well as a study and research perspective. The presence and the sort of white noise as a consequence of the Exxon Valdez oil spill is ever present in the community of Cordova, Alaska. And those are the things that really hit home with me as I started to watch the community reactions on the Gulf Coast to the Deepwater Horizon event. Interestingly enough, Dwayne Gill and I were in Cordova as the oil was still gushing from the wellhead here in the Gulf Coast. And we were talking to folks up there with respect to their involvement in the legal processes and the litigation associated with the oil spill in Alaska. And people looked straight at us and said, "What are you doing here? Why aren't you down there?" And we said, "We're headed that direction." But one of the most interesting and sad things to me was that most of the people that we talked with up there in the summer of 2010 were not able to bring themselves to watch the coverage of what was going on down on the Gulf Coast. It was still that close to them emotionally. And as they tried to move beyond the events that affected their own communities, it was really difficult to have those reminders 24/7 on the television. So I'm going to take this back out a little bit and not focus immediately on marine oil spills. One of the things that is important to note is that what we do know about technological or human-caused disasters, which again is my area of focus, is that it builds on decades worth, actually at this point a century worth, of studies of oil spills and other types of events. This is an explosion that occurred in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that was human-caused. This took place in 1917, and this is the first documented study of the way that psychosocial impacts emerge in communities in the face of societal dimensions of hazards and disasters. So when we talk about psychosocial stress, what we're talking about is the interrelation between social factors and individual level thought and behavior, so mental health in particular, but also the way that these social dimensions affect social disruption. And again, you heard Tim and Catherine talking a little bit about that, as well as Richard, of course. So one of the things that we do in our work is talk about disaster events, both natural and technological and more deliberate, premeditated acts on what we call a continuum of deliberateness. And noting that the more deliberate an act is, the longer the impacts tend to last and the more severe they can be over time. They tend to be much more chronic. So over here on the left-hand side, we have what are considered acts of God and so-called natural disasters. Okay, so a tornado, an earthquake that's not caused by deep wastewater injection and hydraulic fracturing processes, so that's a whole other topic we'll talk about another day. Then in the middle we have events caused by human error, or what we have a fancy word for called recreancy, and that's essentially that there is some party to blame, that there is someone or some organization at which we can point a finger and say, this organization and lack of responsibility on their part, failure to do something that they should have done, enters into the picture. And that's where we find these technological disasters, like the Deepwater Horizon, like the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and like some of the other toxic contamination events that we see. I've added litigation to this continuum. This was out of my dissertation research, where people started talking about the fact that litigation and compensation processes had almost as much impact on the mental health and the social disruption in the communities in which they resided. And then, of course, on the far right, purposeful, premeditated acts such as terrorism and mass shootings. And so where I'm focusing primarily today is in here, but as we know from events like Katrina in particular, there's a lot of overlap in all of these things. So what we have to keep in mind is that this isn't intended to be just a dichotomous binary situation. Disaster events can have overlapping qualities and characteristics. So studies of disasters, this being another human-caused event, started essentially in the United States in about 1972, after the Buffalo Creek flood happened in West Virginia. And in this event, an impoundment, a coal ash impoundment essentially was breached, and 125 people were killed as a consequence. the dam impoundment breached and then flowed down into these communities, disrupting not only lives and ways of lives, but entire communities. The other kinds of events we're talking about would be something like Love Canal and 3 Mile Island. And so again, what we're building on is not just our understanding of marine oil spills, but the social impacts of human-caused disasters in general. So here in the next couple of slides, what I'm going to show you are things that you're going to recognize based on what Tim and Catherine have shared, some of the things that Richard shared earlier as well. So what we have in the aftermath of human-caused disasters is a pervasive and chronic uncertainty about the toxic contamination and the kinds of effects that that has on health and well-being and your ability to tap into those renewable natural resources. You also have contested interpretations of that. Whose fault was it? How bad is it? Is the oil still there? Are the contaminants still there? So this notion of some people saying, everything's fine. Everybody just needs to get on with their lives, when in fact, not everyone in a community or in the scientific community may feel that way. The notion of loss of control. So in natural disasters, or so-called natural disasters, you have this notion that there really was nothing you could control about a tornado coming through, or an earthquake happening, or a hurricane happening. But with technological disasters, we thought we had things under control. We thought we had all the technology that we needed to make things safe. But instead, what we see is these beliefs about we had a loss of control. As mentioned earlier, there are primary responsible parties associated with these technological events typically, and response processes are different. As we heard from our first speaker, the Stafford Act does not kick in terms of technological disasters. We heard a little bit about social vulnerability to environmental hazards, that there are environmental justice issues associated with individuals and groups being more susceptible, perhaps living in more hazard-prone areas. We have disruption of interpersonal and group relationships, as was previously mentioned, and these community ties to the environment. So it's not just about whether they are relying on the environment for their economic foundation, but also whether they engage in subsistence activities and the cultural activities that surround these cycles, these seasonal cycles of harvesting. And when those are disrupted, that causes a whole new set of stressors. And there's this notion of what we call invisible trauma to both the natural and social environments. Again, this contested interpretation, different science telling us different things about what's going on, and then this underlying notion of fissures, of breakups, fragmentation in the community based on different beliefs associated with what's going on in the wake of a technological disaster. We then have secondary trauma associated with what we refer to as the bureaucratic impersonality of compensation, claims, and litigation processes, long-term adverse health outcomes, which of course are still being studied in the wake of Deepwater Horizon, but weren't attended to following the Exxon Valdez oil spill. There's very limited information about that because nobody thought at the time to collect those kinds of baseline data and long-term data. There's a lack of closure, as people call it, with chronic community impacts associated with human-caused or technological disasters. And this notion of recovery, what does that actually look like? Sometimes it's not so much recovery from one of these events as it is a transformation in a given community. So one of the things that I want to point out is that we'll have a handout at the back that's going to go over some of these kinds of events. That was developed out of the 2017 workshop that was mentioned by Chris in Washington, D.C., looking at impacts of marine oil spills, and particularly Deepwater Horizon. But again, most of my work surrounded the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which of course occurred in Alaska in 1989, And this was the first time that there was sort of a convergence of researchers on an oil spill location and communities that were affected by this disaster. And so I'll go back again at this point and say, you know, most of what we know about technological disasters in general has translated over to what we know about marine oil spills. So the fact that many of the researchers in this room and others who are not here that studied the Deepwater Horizon and continue to do so are building on what's a long tradition. We didn't just drop out of the sky and start studying disasters right after this event. There is a strong foundation for the kinds of things that we're looking at and the ways we approach studies of these events. This is the diagram to which I referred. I brought some handouts so that you could have that. But again, it focuses on the various levels and kinds of impacts that you can see potentially in the wake of marine oil spills. Not all of these happen, but again, you can back this out, and it's not just about marine oil spills that we're talking about, even though this was what this diagram was created for. Any kinds of events where there's toxic contamination are going to have some variation of these psychological, physical, economic, sociological, and cultural impacts. So of course you're all familiar with this and these scenarios. So we've drawn upon the work that Louisiana State did. We also did some work in particular focusing on Alabama. At that point, I think Louisiana State was focused primarily on Louisiana with the Community Oil Spill Survey and then branched out over the years to include more of the Gulf Coast communities. So at that point, nobody was focusing on Alabama. It was kind of the forgotten child. And so we chose to look there. But as the things that Tim and Catherine mentioned, additional research showed these kinds of things: mental health impacts, behavioral effects, social disruption related to the disaster. We have the same strong kinds of relationships that have already been discussed, so I won't go into detail about that. But individuals with high level of community attachment experience increased levels of stress. And again, we're seeing some changes in that over time, but the jury is still out with respect to some of the studies that we have going on in Alabama. So one of the things that we had an unfortunate opportunity, as I refer to it, is to study the comparisons between what we know about the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the outcomes of that event over time, as well as the initial Deepwater Horizon event outcomes. The strongest predictor of stress included concerns about family health and economic future, economic loss, connections, as Tim pointed out, to renewable resources, exposure to the oil, and involvement with compensation processes. And this is one of the most important things that we're continuing to learn over time, this last piece with the compensation processes. And one of the things that is very intriguing and is relatively new to the literature is the fact that being a claimant is associated with higher levels of stress and avoidance coping behaviors. That is, avoiding talking about it, avoiding anything that has to do with it, coming to community meetings. People don't want to think about it anymore. But even more important than these individual claimants having stress associated with their involvement in compensation process is the fact that community members at large, whether or not they were involved or have been involved in litigation processes or compensation processes, are having elevated levels of stress and are observing communities at large being more fragmented, that communities at large where they live are experiencing greater levels of stress, and that they too, people who aren't claimants, are avoiding engaging in conversations, discussions, anything having to do with the oil spill. We're also finding, interestingly enough, that this is happening in other technological disaster events where communities at large and non-claimants and non-compensation involved individuals are avoiding participating in these kinds of events. And the most recent study with which I've been involved is an NSF-funded study looking at the longer-term impacts of the Tennessee Valley Authority coal ash spill that I mentioned earlier. And that is a cohort study, a longitudinal study with the same group of people between 2011 and 2013. So these kinds of things, especially the compensation processes, highlight the chronic nature of the social impacts of human-caused disasters like the BP Deepwater Horizon. And one of the things that is a distinction relative to these natural disasters, again, the so-called natural disasters, of which I would not include Katrina at this point, the impacts of natural disasters tend to fade typically anywhere from 18 to 24 months after a disaster event, whereas in part because of the cleanup activities, the uncertainty associated with the toxic contamination, and the ongoing chronic litigation and compensation project activities are really important things to consider here. In closing, so again, now after decades of social science research, we know that there are some things that can be done to ameliorate, to mitigate, to prepare for, and to plan for these kinds of disaster events. We have also been using the findings of our work in particular in looking at social impact assessment before oil and gas development activities and other development activities go on in any given community. So we're doing a lot of work with First Nations groups up in Canada to examine the potential impacts in the event that there is some kind of a hazard event, a disaster. But we're also looking at the stress associated with even the thought of having these oil and gas development activities come into First Nation territories, and understanding that knowing what they know about events that they have seen, even from a distance, can elevate anxiety and levels of stress and concern about these development projects. So one of the things that we're looking at doing, which is exactly what this oil spill workshop is looking at doing, is finding better ways to mitigate, prepare for, or plan for future events. You know, there is a general consensus that it's not if, but it's when there will be another event, maybe not as large as some of the ones that we're talking about, but having communities in a position to respond to in a very rapid manner. Not only with respect to the environmental impacts and the cleanup activities, but to the social dimensions of what might happen in communities based on what we know. It's really important, as this oil spill workshop here is engaging in, is expertise at the local level, understanding that it's not just the scientists, it's not just the formal officials from the Coast Guard and elsewhere who have the knowledge to bring to bear, but the local community members, particularly those engaged in the harvesting of renewable natural resources, that have a lot to say about this and to bring to bear. And we're trying to seek actively significant civic engagement as we go about these activities. We also, as a research community and as responders, are interested in understanding the effectiveness of post-disaster activities, including the way the preparedness response and the mitigation processes are unfolding. And one of the things, again, that I'd like to point out is there's something that we can do in particular about how these compensation processes work. You know, we may not be able to prevent oil spills, we may not be able to contain every oil spill, but we can do something, I truly believe this, about the way the compensation processes either drag on or affect individuals and affect communities, about the way they're experiencing the mental health impacts, PTSD, and other social disruption as a consequence. And so we need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of these kinds of activities. We heard Tim talk a little bit about the relationship between resilience and vulnerability, and one of the things that I'd like to point out is that as communities are engaging in broad-based resilience activities for overall community well-being, whether it's associated with disaster events or not, just day-to-day lives and economic resilience and so forth, it's important that we think about these things and include them in ways in which we're planning for other hazard and disaster events. And it's also important that we start thinking about building consensus on how to measure these things so that different organizations that are going into communities and gathering data, spending your time, spending research time, spending taxpayer money, spending researchers' time, so that people don't get overburdened with researchers plopping themselves down in communities and asking what to local members of communities might seem like repetitive questions. And didn't somebody just appear on my doorstep a couple of weeks ago asking the very same questions? We call that assessment fatigue. And we're doing everything in our power to collaborate and to cooperate so that those kinds of situations don't arise. And with that, I will leave it so that we can move on to our panel discussion. Thank you.